Part 3. I still considered myself to be in hell, but it comforted me to know I wasn't alone. The source of the inner voice was in hell too, right there with me. And since the larger mind had cared enough to stop my suicide plans, I had complete faith it would eventually put me to work. It did. The following Saturday morning, towards the end of March, I awoke with a clear image in my mind of a shy young man who lived at the opposite end of my hallway. We had never spoken, and I'd seen him only a few times, his skinny, awkwardly hunched body that towered over the other males of the hall, and his thick glasses which magnified the eyes of his pale face so that he looked like a human parody of a praying mantis. As I pondered the image of this quiet, bug-eyed stranger from my hallway, I received a message. It wasn't a message in words so much as a thought ball of information that suddenly formed itself instantaneously in my mind. 1. The young man was beginning to suspect he was gay. 2. He was afraid of being ostracized by his parents and his church. And 3. He was contemplating suicide. My heart leapt with concern. If what I had received was true, I very much wanted to help this young man, but how could I possibly help him when I didn't know him? Then came another thought ball of information, accompanied by yet another clear image. I saw myself standing beside this young man, playing my flute as he played the piano. I knew then how I might approach him. I could request that he practice with me some of the flute pieces I had performed as a high school student. I still had my flute and music, and most of my old recital pieces had included the accompanying parts for piano. However, since the music was of a higher level of difficulty, the piano parts might be too challenging for him, if in fact he even was a pianist. What if he didn't play the piano? What if I ended up making a fool of myself? He might think I was crazy. The image of us practicing together, so crystal clear, flashed again in my mind. But added to that was a new sense of urgency. What if he killed himself? Would I be able to live with my guilt if I found out he had committed suicide and I had done nothing to reach out to him? I had demanded that the larger mind put me to work. If this was indeed my work assignment, it would be wrong for me to turn away from it, most especially if my reason for walking away was that I feared someone might think I was insane. Wasn't this young man's life more important than the face of normalcy I tried always to project? But even if I did go through with this crazy work assignment, what reason did I have to request that he practice with me? I needed a believable lie. And when I told this believable lie, I myself would have to be believable. Thank goodness I had had some acting experience in high school. "Hi," I said cheerily, an hour later, when, after knocking on what I thought was his door, the tall, bug-eyed young man appeared, wearing jeans and a white undershirt. "My name is Shelley," I continued. "I live at the other end of the hall. I was told you play the piano?" To my great relief, he said yes, but his large bug-like eyes never met my own. He stared at the floor, waiting for me to continue. Confidently, in full performance mode, I spit out my believable lie. "I have an upcoming recital the end of semester back at home, and I've got a pianist lined up for the concert, but what I need now is a practice pianist here at school. someone I can meet with, say, for maybe an hour once a week. Do you think you'd be able to practice with me?" Maintaining his view of the floor, he pushed the bridge of his glasses up his nose with one finger and quietly responded, "Yes." "Thank you," I said. "I'll need to sign us up for one of the practice rooms. What's your schedule like?" "Wednesday afternoons are good," he said. Then he surprised me. His gaze shifted to the top of my shoulder. "We could use a piano at my church. They let me play over there whenever I like." "Great," I said. "Wednesday it is. What time and which church?" He gave me the name and location of a church that was close to campus, and we agreed to meet at 4 the following Wednesday. "Do you want me to go get my music?" I asked. "No," he said. "You can bring it on Wednesday." He shut the door, and I hightailed it to my room for my flute and satchel of music, then on to the practice rooms of the music building so that I could brush up on an hour's worth of old recital pieces. It was a good thing I practiced. The tall, bug-eyed young man was, I discovered, an excellent pianist. I realized, once I heard him play, that I would need to continue practicing on a regular basis for the remainder of the semester. Not only did I need to keep him convinced that I was preparing for a concert, I also needed to keep myself in league with his musical abilities. During every practice session, I had to concentrate hard to keep my mind and body at performance mode. This was due largely to the fact that during each of our practice sessions, I sensed a current of energy flowing through me directly to him. It felt like a stream of nurturing, divine mother love. And if I happened to step closer to him in order to make a comment about the piano music, a silent river of words telepathically transmitted through me to him joined the flow of energy. "Mama loves you, baby. Mama loves you, baby." These words, in combination with the energy I felt flowing through me, always brought tears to my eyes, and I would have to step farther away from him in order not to lose emotional control over myself. The power and impact of this motherly message grew even stronger each time I felt the energy flow leading my hand to lightly touch him on his shoulder or on his back as I thanked him before leaving the Sunday school room where we practiced. Always, while my hand was touching him, it felt as if the energy flow enveloped me so completely that, for a brief moment, the mother energy and I became one. And I knew during each of those moments that this young man was loved completely and unconditionally because I loved him then completely and unconditionally, even though at the level of my personal conscious mind, I didn't know him. Later, I became friends with a young man named John who knew the pianist with whom I had practiced. "He recently came out of the closet," John happened to mention one day, referring to the pianist. "Oh, really?" I said. "I hope he's doing well." "He seems fine," John said. "He's been meeting with an Episcopal priest every week, and that seems to have helped." "You mean because he thought homosexuality was a sin?" "Yeah," he said, "but his priest has eased his mind." "Well, thank goodness for that," I said. My heart felt as if it were dancing. I no longer needed to worry. The pianist was going to be okay. At the time of this conversation with my friend John, I was a sophomore living off campus in an apartment I shared with Sal. John lived in the same building one floor up. The year before, he had lived in my dorm, though we had not met until the very end of my freshman school year. I can't remember why he had suddenly appeared at my dormitory door, Perhaps he was selling boxes of candy or donuts for some kind of a fundraiser, but I do remember that the moment I saw him and he smiled, I felt that I already knew him at the soul level. I felt an immense attraction for him and even wondered briefly, was he the someone better my high school boyfriend Bill had predicted I would meet? The next semester, the beginning of my sophomore year, when I discovered that John and I were living in the same apartment building, I took this as a sign that we were indeed meant to be together. And we did begin to spend a lot of time together, mainly cooking for each other whenever our roommates were away. Sitting across the table from John during a meal, I always felt as if I were basking in the light of his soul. And because of this, it didn't matter that his religious beliefs were so different from my own. His evangelical Christian beliefs were no more significant to me than what choice of shirt and pants he had decided to wear that day. And perhaps John felt the same way about me because he never seemed to be offended by any religiously radical thing I had to say. One night, dining together in his apartment, the moment John bowed his head to say grace, I rudely interrupted, "I can't give thanks for this food." He looked up, startled, but with a slight smile that seemed to say, "What unusual idea is coming out of you this day?" "How," I said, "can I be truly thankful for this food when in this moment I don't actually feel hungry? If I were to give formal thanks for this food, that would be a lie." He laughed, reminding me, as he so often did, of the radiantly happy and childlike Fred Rogers from the PBS children's series Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. "Well, you may not be thankful for this food," he said, "but I am. You don't have to join me, but I'm going to say grace now." "Okay," I said, smiling in return. I had known what he was going to say before he said it, and while John verbalized his prayer of thanks to the Lord for the food we were about to eat, I silently thanked the larger mind for John. I only wished that he sometimes looked at me with a glint of lust in his eyes. I had tried wearing clothing that would attract him, and one time my heart had fluttered when he had said, "The way the light of the setting sun is hitting your face right now, the blue in your shirt matches perfectly the blue of your eyes." Say more," I had wanted to say. But that was as physical as John ever got. If we happened to be walking somewhere, I would try to put my body as close to his as possible without touching, but he never once brushed up against me. Sometimes I wondered if it were for religious reasons John never touched me or looked at me lustfully. He attended a Bible church where every Sunday the minister crawled his way through each book of the Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, explaining the Christian interpretation of the text. John said he thought it was a good way for him to learn what was in the Bible. He also liked how the minister opened the floor for comments from the congregation at the end of his biblical lectures, which, I discovered the Sunday John invited me to attend his church, were gracious and affirming of the minister's point of view. To me, it seemed as if the members of John's church were not thinking for themselves, but were only parroting the biblical interpretations of their minister. It was one of the most boring church experiences I had ever encountered, but I could tell John's church was full of earnest people who cared deeply about their faith and who wanted very much to live a life they thought would be pleasing to the Lord. Did John not touch me because he was trying to live a life that would be pleasing to God? Or did he not touch me because he was gay, like his recently outed friend, the pianist. If he were gay, I didn't want to repulse him by trying to plant a kiss on his lips. I kept waiting for him either to tell me he was gay or to make some kind of a move that would prove to me he wasn't. But as frustrated as I became over John's lack of lust for me, I grew more and more in awe of his compassion. John was the most kind and empathetic human being I had ever met. He was also the best listener I'd ever known. His eyes never left my face whenever I spoke to him, and I could tell he tried very hard to understand me, even when I disagreed with him concerning matters of God, Jesus, or the Bible. "I'm curious," he said one night from across the table of yet another shared meal. "Why is it exactly you don't believe Jesus is God?" "Basically," I said, "it's because when I try to imagine Jesus as God rather than as a prophet, it just doesn't feel right to my heart." He gave me one of his Fred Rogers smiles. "But it's in the Bible," he said. "Surely you can't ignore that." "Why should I trust anything in the Bible?" I said. "Because the church tells me to do so?" What I didn't tell him was that my distrust of the church had been strengthened by Elaine Pagels' best-selling book, The Gnostic Gospels, which I had recently purchased out of curiosity. Pagel's book described how in the earliest days of Christianity, there were far more ways of defining Jesus and interpreting his teachings than the church had led us to believe. In fact, some of the early Gnostic interpretations of Jesus and God had sounded similar to my own beliefs. For instance, there were Gnostics who believed that God's Spirit is found within each of us. But if such a belief had prevailed within Christianity, spiritual power would have remained in the realm of the individual instead of within the walls of church. My anger towards the church, which had first sprouted inside Martha and Julie and Judy's church, had grown tenfold thanks to Pagel's book. But I didn't want to talk anymore to John about my anger towards the church. He loved his own church too much. Besides, he was laughing now, amused as always by my religiously radical nature. In such moments, it looked as if he were thinking, "I don't understand you, but you're still my friend." Another belief of mine which confused John was the concept of reincarnation. "Who taught you to believe such a thing?" he once asked. "No one," I said. "I just have this feeling that I've lived before." I didn't tell him that I believed we had known each other and loved each other in a past life. I also didn't tell him how shortly after Sal's father had died of a heart attack, I became obsessed with worry over what it would be like when my own father died. In the midst of my worries, the image of a Native American man with long black braids on either side of his head flashed in my mind, and in that instant, I knew this was what my father had looked like in a past life. In this other lifetime, we had been equals. He had been my closest friend. We had hunted together and had bravely gone into battle together, thrilled over the prospect of killing our enemies. When he dies, I found myself thinking, I will be saying goodbye to an old friend. I had wanted to remember more from this other lifetime, but the rest of my memory of that life experience quickly faded. In the same way that most of our dreams, no matter how real they may feel while we are dreaming, begin to fade upon awakening. Only a few of my dreams had never faded. One of them starred John. In the dream, so unlike the way he was in waking life, he had rushed towards me, eagerly pulling me to his chest, And in the moment that our lips touched, I felt myself climaxing. What a joy to be joined with my beloved. That was the moment when, like a bucket of cold water turned upside down over my head, a message arrived from deep inside. Though still soundless, it was the first time the inner voice had spoken to me in a dream. At the level of your hearts, you were too similar, it said. There would be no growth. Then I was lifted far above the earth, and I could see the path of my life, a thin, glowing line that ran along the ground beside the lit-up path of John's life. I followed the two tracks of our lives, so close but never touching. And then I saw how, at some point, our two paths took sudden, abrupt, right-angle turns away from each other, each moving into regions that were separated by a great distance. In the dream, I began to cry. I was still crying when I opened my eyes in the darkness of my little bedroom in the apartment I shared with Sal. "Who cares about growth?" I whispered. "I just want to be happy." "There is another," came the voice from within. But I continued to cry. It felt as if a piece of my heart had been ripped out of me. My friendship with John continued as before. He still treated me as if I were a non-huggable sister, and my attraction for him never abated. If anything, it grew stronger. I kept telling myself that this time the message I had received from within was wrong. Why else was I still so obsessed with John? At night, alone in my bed, my mind continued to replay the good part of the dream, the incredible sensation I had felt when we had kissed. Why could I not know such passion now? Soon I was creating a great variety of imagined encounters with John, and with the help of my hand, I tried the best I could to recreate in a more physical sense each of my imagined encounters. During the day, my fantasies about John continued to haunt me. Why could he not sense how much I yearned for his touch? Even if we weren't meant to be together in the future, couldn't we be together now? One evening, in the kitchen of our apartment, while pouring myself a glass of tea, I turned to Sal, who was fixing dinner for herself and her boyfriend, Beau. "Do you think John is gay?" I asked. "No," she said. "He's just shy. Don't worry. He'll come around." Not necessarily, I thought. I remembered how in my dream the paths of our lives had been close, but had never come together. Why couldn't our paths have had one single point of connection, one brief second of physical contact? One Friday afternoon, perhaps because she felt sorry for me, Sal invited me to attend a party that Beau and all the other UNC football players were hosting. "You need to get out," she said. "It'll be good for you." I'd always hated parties, but it was a Friday night and I was bored, and I thought I could use a distraction from my continual obsession over John in my dream. But once I arrived, it all came back to me why I detested these kinds of parties. Stuck in what felt like a living hell of loud music and the groping hands of strangers upon my bottom, I decided that my only escape, until Beau and Sal told me it was time to go, would be alcohol. All it took was 2 mixed drinks. I don't remember introducing myself or ever learning his name, but in one instant I was swaying to the loud music, and in another instant my lips were locked to the mouth of a blue-eyed, blonde football player, his tongue deeply plunging the inner depths of my mouth. His arms, holding me firmly, felt like steel, and the muscles of his thick thighs felt like walls as the warm mound that bulged from his tight polyester pants pressed against my stomach. His light-colored shirt, also polyester, was unbuttoned almost down to the top of his stomach, which made it easy for me to run my hand against the smooth, flesh-covered armored plate that was his muscular chest. Suddenly he moved his tongue playfully towards my ear, and he murmured in a low, gravelly voice, "You want to go to my room?" "Yes," I said. "Oh, God, yes." Little did I know that Sal and her boyfriend Beau were watching as I exited the party with my muscle-bound stud, whose polyester bulge was probably visible from across the room. We were perched on the edge of his bed, and he was diving towards my mouth with his lips, one hand at the back of my neck, the other very close to the side of my breast, when suddenly the door flew open, and I jumped. It was Beau. "Shelley, you don't want to do this." He grabbed my arm and pulled me off the bed. "But I do," I said. "Let me go." I tried to wriggle free, but his grip was strong. "That's the alcohol talking," said Beau. "Come on, time to go." And he dragged me towards the door. When I turned to look back, my muscle-bound stud was sitting on the edge of his mattress, his legs spread wide open, a hand upon his thigh, a seductive grin on his face that said, "Come on, you know you want it." I tried once again to wriggle free, but Beau was stronger. He pulled me out the door into the hallway. Sal was waiting for us, looking very amused. I pouted as she and Beau escorted me out of the dorm, away from my night of passion, which I was sure would have been exquisite. How dare they treat me like a child? The next morning, feeling a bit mushy in my head, it finally dawned on me that the night before I had given no thought at all to the risk of pregnancy or to the danger of contracting a sexually transmitted disease. A sense of relief ran through me. Thank goodness Beau had stepped in like a big brother to pull me away from my polyester-clad muscular Casanova. "Thank you, Beau," I said when I saw him later that day with Sal. "There's no telling what would have happened if I'd had sex with that guy." Sal laughed. "I know exactly what would have happened. You would have gotten a nice batch of crabs in your crotch." I smiled, but Beau shook his head. "She's not joking," he said. "That guy has had the most sex of anyone on the entire Carolina football team." That made me remember the comment of the football player from my high school concerning his teammates' opinion of me. I wondered, how would those old high school football players rate me now? It was good that my crotch was still crabless, and it was good that I wasn't pregnant, but it was not so good that my relationship with John continued to remain completely platonic. I never received another message from within concerning John, but I did on occasion continue to receive other silent communications from within, each one helping more and more to weaken my obsession with John simply by taking my mind off of him. One of these messages concerned my family. Back at home at the beginning of my summer break, I had asked the larger mind why my father was radiating such a strong energy of distress. From within came the soundless message: he thinks he is in love with another woman. Who is she? I silently asked, and the face of a woman instantly came to my mind, a woman who worked with my father in the office building he had recently constructed for his private ophthalmology practice. I was surprised, not by the idea that my father would think he was in love with another woman, but that this other woman was, in my opinion, only moderately attractive. I considered my father to be a handsome man. Couldn't he have done better? I found myself wondering. When I asked my father about the matter the next day, whether or not he had fallen in love with this particular female employee, he looked frightened. And when I mentioned her name, he said, "How did you know?" "Just a hunch," I lied. Because I encouraged my father to be honest with my mother, they soon separated. Almost immediately, the energy of my mother's grief became so great that at times I could hardly bear it. One day, having driven away from the house in order to escape the feel of all that grief, I began to cry. Pulling off the road into an empty parking lot, I asked myself, why is her grief so strong? Then it occurred to me that on top of dealing with a husband who had just recently left her, perhaps she was also, at a subconscious level, revisiting the sense of abandonment she surely had felt as a 3-year-old child after her mother Alice was killed in a car accident. Suddenly, a storm of tears erupted from a deep place inside me, and in that moment came another message from within. This is what it's like to be alive. Instantly, my tears stopped. I realized then that for me, to be fully alive meant to allow myself to feel things deeply. I also realized that loving another sometimes means sharing the pain of that other. If loving my mother meant sharing the burden of her grief, then I would do so willingly. After that, I no longer needed to escape the grief my mother radiated. It no longer frightened me, simply because I felt that I now understood it. Not too long after that, as I was worrying about my parents and their relationship, I received another inner message. It is going to be okay. And to my surprise, it was. Although my parents had stubbornly refused my advice to seek counseling, "Counseling is for crazy people," my father had said, somehow they managed to get back together. Once again, we were a family, and that pleased my heart immensely. One of the other messages I received that year concerned a professor of mine, an anthropology professor who, to my eye, looked as if she could have been the younger sister of the world-renowned anthropologist Margaret Mead. "Go to her," came the soundless voice one afternoon, and an image of my anthropology professor flashed through my mind. "She needs a friend," came the second message from within. Holy crap, I thought. No way, she's a professor. I had never been any closer than 30 feet from her. Her class, Intro to Anthropology, was huge, filling an auditorium that seated between 200 and 300 students. There had not been a reason to see her during office hours. Her class was easy, her tests all multiple choice, and unlike most of my other courses, her class never bored me. I had enjoyed every single lecture and all of the required reading. My average in the class was an A. What would happen if I barged into her office asking personal questions? In addition to labeling me a loon, she might also get angry, and that could impact my final grade in a class that up until now had been nothing but an exceedingly positive experience. No, this time the inner voice had gone too far. It would be inappropriate for a student to cross such a line with her professor. This was one message I would not heed. But I was a little curious. During my next class session, I sat a bit closer to the front of the auditorium in order to get a better look at this professor. Her voice was the same, her body's stance behind the wooden podium on the stage exactly as it had always been. But now that I was closer, I could see in her eyes a look of deep anguish. Before I knew it, my heart was hooked. By the end of the week, on a late Friday afternoon, I was at her office door knocking. "Come in," she said. At the sound of her voice, my whole body began to tremble. "Hi," I said, when I was a few feet in front of her desk. "I know we've never met, but I'm in your intro anthropology class, and, well, this is probably going to sound a bit strange." I dared not say anything about the inner voice. "But I've had a feeling that maybe something might be wrong in your life. If there isn't, please forgive me. Sometimes I can be a little weird, but I guess I just wanted to check in with you to make sure you're okay." "Please, shut the door," she said. I stepped back to the door and shut it. Now I was really feeling scared. "Have a seat." She motioned me towards a chair in front of her large desk, littered by a slew of books and papers that surrounded one lamp and a fat, primitive-looking statue of a naked woman. Was she about to admonish me for getting too personal? Why had I done this? Still trembling, I waited for the verbal blow. I watched as she stared at the open cathedral of space she had fashioned with her hands, only the tips of her fingers touching. "Your feeling is correct," she said. "There is something wrong." My heart leapt. I waited for her to continue, but she seemed unable to speak. Her head drooped forward, and her hands disappeared into her lap, beyond the mound of mess upon her desk. I waited and watched, eager to hear her story, but soon my curiosity turned to discomfort. Had she lost her ability to speak? When at last she raised her head, there were tears in her eyes. "I've just been diagnosed with cancer," she said. "You're the only one who knows, other than my doctor." She began to cry. I didn't know what to do. "Larger mind, help," I silently transmitted. I opened my mouth. I had to say something. "Larger mind, where are you?" No response. So I said the only thing I could think to say. "I am so sorry." I waited as she cried, and a part of me wanted to hug her, but I was frozen to my chair. I continued to watch in agony as she cried, torn between a desire to help and a desire to disappear. Finally, when her tears were spent, she reached among the stacks of books and papers on her desk until she found a box of tissues. "Forgive me," she said, and she blew her nose. "Please don't apologize," I said, and I silently called out again to the larger mind, "Help me out. I don't know what to do." She looked as if she were waiting for me to speak. "Again, let me say," I stammered, "that I am so sorry. This is horrible news." And then finally, I was struck with an inspired thought. "I think the universe wanted you to know that you're not alone, even though it may appear you are," I said. "I think this is why I felt strongly driven to come here today, so that you would know you're not alone." Smiling sadly, she said, "Thank you. You are most kind." She invited me to stop by again, and I did a couple of weeks later at the end of the semester. But during that visit, she asked if I would consider moving in with her. "I have a room in my house you could live in free of charge," she said. "I would give you access to my kitchen and laundry room, and in exchange, I was thinking you could drive me to my chemo treatments." Suddenly, I felt a silent alarm go off in my belly. No! It was similar to how I had felt when the year before those students from my dorm had begun knocking at my door in the evenings, and I had been forced to go to the graduate library every night as a form of escape. Even if I had not had a legitimate excuse, I still would have told her no. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm in the middle of a year's lease on an apartment with my roommate." The face of my professor dropped in disappointment, and I couldn't help it. I felt so sorry for her. I had to do something to lift her spirits. "How would you like to stop by for dinner next weekend?" I asked. It was the weekend before my winter break. She smiled. "That would be lovely." I gave her directions to the apartment I shared with Sal, and when she arrived the next weekend, I served a simple meal of spaghetti, bread, and salad with a frozen pie for dessert. Our conversation was a bit awkward, but I tried my best to be polite and engaging. At the end of our dinner, she reached into her large pocketbook and pulled out a small, shiny black vase. There was a lined drawing of a white flower etched into the glaze of the vase. It looked like a dogwood blossom. "I made this," she said. "I want you to have it, a small token of my gratitude." "Thank you," I said. I tore off a sheet from a nearby notebook so I could write down my phone number. "If you ever need me to drive you to chemo treatments," I said, "please give me a call. I'd be happy to do so, as long as I don't have to be in class or at work." "Where are you working?" she asked. "The local classical station, WUNC." "My goodness," she said. "You're on the air?" "Yes, but only part-time, Saturday and Sunday mornings." I took a breath, prepared now to tell her the story of how I had gotten the job, but she stood up. "I'm sorry," she said, and she leaned in to give me a quick hug. "I'm suddenly not feeling so well. I need to go." Though I had given her my contact information and would have taken her to chemo treatments had she asked, I wasn't surprised when months passed and I didn't hear from her. She had not wanted to impose, I assumed, and I admit a part of me was relieved. My anthropology professor may not have had the time or been well enough to hear the story of how I came to work for the Chapel Hill public radio station, but to me it was one of the most incredible stories I had to tell at that point in my life. When I shared the story with family members or friends, however, there was always one key part of the story that wasn't included: its beginning. One fall morning, which marked the true beginning of my story, moments after turning off my alarm, I received a soundless message from within. "It is time for you to apply for a job at WUNC." What? I sat up in bed, shocked. The classical station I had been listening to since the beginning of my freshman year? The radio beside my bed, though I had not yet turned it on that morning, was tuned to WUNC. It was always tuned to the local public radio station. But there was no way the message could have been right. Not this time. I must have been dreaming. "It is time for you to apply for a job at WUNC," came the message from within yet again. "But I can't apply for a job there," I silently replied. "I don't have any radio experience." "No, absolutely not." The next day, it was as if my feet led me to the base of the concrete steps at the back of Swain Hall, the building on the edge of campus where WUNC's studios were housed at that time. There was no way I was going to walk to the top of those stairs, but somehow I was unable to turn away. My feet remained motionless, as if glued to the sidewalk. "No," I transmitted to the larger mind. "Leave me alone. Absolutely not." I had known, even during my freshman year of college, that this was the location of my favorite public radio station, a station that supplied music, state news, and a variety of NPR programming to all of central North Carolina. I had seen the sign for the station every time I had walked past the back of Swain Hall on my way to the music building the year before. Though the station's building was located on the campus of UNC, it was not the student station. The campus station was WXYC, and it was located in the Student Union building. One time when I passed by the hallway that led to WXYC's studios, I had felt the floor vibrating beneath my feet. They liked to play hard rock music at the student station, as loud as possible, it seemed. WUNC, on the other hand, played music that was soothing to my ears. The year before, when I'd been in a dorm, I had often gone to sleep listening to the station through a pair of clunky headphones that helped to drown out all the noises of my dorm mates. At WUNC, they played classical music during the day and jazz at night, though they always went off the air at midnight, at which time I would wake up, take the clunky headphones off, and try to get back to sleep. By 6 the next morning, the station would be back on the air, and as I got ready for my early morning classes, I would listen to the jingle of NPR's Morning Edition, the soothing baritone voice of host Bob Edwards, the clipped nasal delivery of Carl Castle's world and national news reports, and the smooth but chipper voice of the local morning man, Martin Serjan, who told us what was happening around the state and what we could expect from the weather that day. Kevin Wolf, Craig Curtis, and Gary Shivers were some of the names of the other local announcers whose voices I had come to know. There was no way, absolutely no way, I would ever go into a place like that and apply for a job. Why was this crazy idea still floating around in my head? The announcers on WUNC sounded incredible. They were so professional. Surely they would be insulted if a peon like me showed up asking for a job. Every single day, for about 2 weeks, my feet continued to walk their way to the base of the concrete steps of Swain Hall. Finally, one morning after an 8 o'clock class, standing yet again at the base of those concrete steps, I suddenly found myself asking the same question I had asked before I had gotten up the nerve to speak to the young pianist. What do I have to lose? Not anything at all, I decided. The folks at WUNC didn't know me, had never seen me, and would never lay eyes on me ever again if, after making a fool of myself, they laughed me out the door. That settled it. The next day, I allowed my feet to climb those concrete steps. I wasn't a bit surprised or even hurt when Kevin Wolf tried gently and politely to steer me back out the door. He had been called upstairs to deal with me after a woman who worked in the station's development office had decided she didn't know what to do with me. Oddly enough, once I was inside the station's building, I found that I didn't want to leave. The space felt magical. Surely it would be heaven on earth to work in such a building. I only needed to figure out how to keep Kevin from kicking me out the door. "You don't understand," he said. We simply don't need any new voices at this time. But I could work in your office filing papers, I said. You do realize this isn't the student station, right? His young face and the roundness of his smooth cheeks amazed me. I had thought he would be in his 50s, but he only looked to be 25. I know it's not the student station, I said. I hate the student station. WUNC is the only radio station I ever listened to. A new idea struck. You know, I used to work at my dad's office as his janitor. Maybe I could clean the station for free as a volunteer. At the word volunteer, Kevin's face changed. It's true that we've used volunteer announcers in the past to fill in for the regular employees, but we're moving away from that practice. Listen, I said, I'm not here to get on the air. I have no radio experience. I'm here because I love this station, and I'm willing to do anything at all to help you guys out. Perhaps he was beginning to realize just how difficult it would be to get rid of me. Tell you what, he said, straightening his wire-framed glasses. I'll let you make a quick demo tape. Then I really do have to get back to work, okay? I will always remember the thrill I felt as I followed him into the basement of the building, the very bowels of the station. But my whole body began to shake after he asked me to sit down in a small, barely lit studio. Through a thick glass window to my right, I saw the mid-morning announcer Craig Curtis, who was on the air in the main studio, the announcer's studio, I was told. Both studios were lit by a small goose-necked lamp that was bolted to the desk of a soundboard with a multitude of round buttons and sliding switches. At the top of the soundboard's console were the half-circle VU meters, each with its own tiny bobbing needle that registered the volume units of whatever sounds came through the board. I was handed a piece of rough yellow paper that had been torn from a clicking machine in the hallway, a machine Kevin had referred to as the Wire, which was short, he told me, for the Associated Press Wire News Service. Here's a forecast and some news headlines, he said. When you're ready to begin, press this button here. The mic's already on. Then he demonstrated with his hand how far I would need to keep my mouth from the large microphone positioned at the end of a jointed metal arm that could be swiveled from side to side. The mic was encased in what appeared to be a thin layer of soft black foam. This is so crazy, I thought after he was gone. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm actually doing this. After pushing the red button, I positioned myself at the proper distance from the mic and, doing my best to imitate the radio voices I had been listening to since the beginning of college, I read aloud the weather forecast and the news headlines. Afterwards, Kevin didn't seem at all impressed as he listened to my voice on the reel-to-reel tape. Even I could hear how shaky my voice sounded as I delivered the news and the weather, but I didn't care. I felt as if I were floating. I had had the experience of a lifetime. It no longer mattered if I got a job at the station. For the second time in my life since my flute recital at the All Souls Cathedral in Asheville, it felt as if I had touched the entrance to heaven. Surely no one who worked for WUNC could ever be unhappy. I thanked Kevin profusely for the opportunity to have auditioned, and then I walked out of the station, back into the sunshine, expecting never to hear from him again. To my surprise, he called the next day. Would you be willing to work as a volunteer on Saturdays? He asked. Yes, I exclaimed. And that is how, less than a week after making a shaky-voiced audition tape at WUNC, I found myself on the air in the same exact chair where I had seen Craig Curtis working his mid-morning shift. It was my new job as a volunteer to play the reel-to-reel tapes of the Metropolitan Opera rebroadcast on Saturdays. Kevin had explained to me earlier how to operate the tape machines. He told me I would have 10 seconds to say during the brief silence of the station break at the beginning of the intermission, "You're listening to 91.5 FM WUNC." After that short snippet of an on-air announcement, the light of the studio's phone began to blink. I picked up the phone. "WUNC, may I help you?" "I heard you," came the booming voice of a man. "It's Kevin. I was listening just now. You sounded wonderful. You're a natural. I thought you would sound nervous like you did on your audition tape, but you sounded like a pro. Congratulations." Though I didn't share this with Kevin, I knew how I had managed not to sound nervous on the air. Sitting alone in a basement studio of an empty building on a Saturday had made it easy for me to imagine, even though I was on the air, that I was simply talking to myself. Not too long after that, I received word from Kevin that the station manager, Gary Shivers, also liked the sound of my voice. Within 2 months, I was working as the part-time paid weekend morning announcer. My shift was 6 to 10 a.m., Saturdays and Sundays, though I also filled in occasionally for the weekday announcers when they were on vacation or had to take a day off. As I had always suspected, it was absolute heaven working for WUNC. Not only was the music beautiful, all the announcers seemed to genuinely enjoy their jobs as well as each other's company. It didn't matter that I was at least 10 years younger than everyone else, including baby-faced Kevin. I was taken into the fold of my new radio family, invited to lunches, to barbecues and picnics, and encouraged to speak up whenever political, religious, or philosophical discussions were afoot. No matter how bad or how boring or how discouraging or how lonely my week had been, I was always at peace once I stepped through the door that led to the basement studios of WUNC. I am sure that had someone ever observed me through a hidden camera in the announcer's studio, my image would have made them happy. Most especially when the music I played on the air touched a chord in my heart. Leaning back in the announcer's chair, eyes closed, a smile upon my face, arms reaching up towards the ceiling, my hands would gently sway in time to the music that made me feel as if my soul were dancing. Always, in such moments, I would think, it doesn't get any better than this. If I could, I would have majored in radio. And that's exactly what I said to Sal one day. "But you can major in radio," she said. "Huh? It's known as the Radio Television Motion Picture Major, or RTVMP. What an excellent idea, I decided, though I wouldn't be able to claim it as my major until I had taken at least one RTVMP class. I registered not only for the RTVMP intro class for the following term, the spring semester of my sophomore year, but also for the Intro to Journalism class. I had discovered that all RTVMP majors were required to take the Intro Journalism class, and since I had always hated writing, I figured it would be best to get that class out of the way as soon as possible. No one was more shocked than I when, a few weeks into my spring semester, I found myself yawning through every RTVMP class, but utterly thrilled by all my writing assignments in the journalism course. How could this be? I hated writing. Even in high school, I had always had a problem with the blank page, staring and staring at the crisp white sheet of paper in my typewriter night after night until around 2 o'clock in the morning, when, hours before the paper was actually due, the words would finally come. My high school teachers had never been impressed by my writing. How could they have been? All of my papers had been rough drafts. Who has the time for revisions when the sun is rising as you're typing the last sentence of a paper that's due in a couple of hours? Back in those days, the days before laptops and iPads and inexpensive desktop computers, to revise meant to retype, and often that meant retyping everything, the entire paper from beginning to end. Looking back, I would say there were 4 reasons I enjoyed this particular journalism class. First, our feature story assignments were short, no more than 2 to 5 double-spaced pages in length. Secondly, we were allowed to choose any topic we liked, as long as our subject matter involved interviewing our fellow human beings and our topic was of interest to the general public. Thirdly, our professor for the class, an adjunct instructor who had worked for many years as a reporter for the Charlotte Observer, had an incredible sense of humor which kept the class laughing. And last but not least, the instructor liked me. I think he saw something in me that was worth affirming. I was so honored by his attention that, for the first time ever, I found myself really wanting to please my teacher. Among other things, my feature story topics had included reflexology, a small-town dog show in nearby Carrboro, my first ever visit as a sort of amateur religious anthropologist to an African American church. My friend John went with me because I was too afraid to go by myself. And in honor of the gay pianist with whom I had practiced music the year before, my most difficult topic of all, the challenges a gay college student faces when he or she decides it's time to come out of the closet. But of all the essays I wrote that semester, the story that captured my professor's heart was my childhood account of having fallen in love with the classical pieces of music my father had played on the piano. It wasn't at all a typical feature story. I had not, for instance, interviewed anyone other than my own memory. But the essay had jumped from my fingertips onto the keys of my typewriter. It was an inspired piece straight from my heart. After reading it, my professor said, "This is really good. You could get it published in a small to mid-sized paper as a Father's Day feature." Then, to my surprise, he asked me to read it aloud to the rest of the class. I could tell afterwards that they were touched as well, and I was reminded of what it had felt like when I had performed Bach's Partita for solo flute before that audience in the All Souls Cathedral in Asheville. That was when I realized that music wasn't the only way for a human heart to connect to other hearts. Writing could also serve such a purpose. Was this the way I was meant to love others? My heart glowed with joy as I exited the classroom that day. I knew then that if I could write similar kinds of feature stories, stories from my heart that touched the hearts of others, I would be very, very happy. That afternoon, just a few days before the beginning of spring term finals, I made a beeline to my advisor's office so I could officially declare my new major. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." I told him that I wanted to major in journalism because I planned to be a writer. "Okay, everyone, listen up," said our journalism professor on the last day of the intro journalism class. It was the day of our final exam. Standing beside him was a police officer. "This here is Officer Brown from the Chapel Hill Police Department. For the first half hour of this exam period, we're going to have a press conference. When I tell you to begin, each of you will be allowed to ask Officer Brown questions. Raise your hands and he'll call upon you. At the end of 30 minutes, the press conference will be over and you'll have the rest of the 2-hour exam period to write your stories." Each of us had beside our typewriters a thick stack, probably 50 pages, of yellow paper for note-taking and typing. Did we really need that much paper for an interview? Our professor turned to glance at the clock above the chalkboard behind him. Then, holding up a hand, but still facing the clock, he said, "Press conference, beginning." The hand came down. "Now!" The battle began, with my classmates continually launching their rapid-fire questions, and Officer Brown, ever the good officer, keeping pace with his own brave volley of responses, never pausing to take a breath. I could barely keep up. Before I ever got to the end of a hurriedly scribbled dictation of one of Officer Brown's responses, yet another question would be hurled from a student's desk, and I would have to leave one recorded response half finished in order to go on to the next. I was so busy trying to capture the words exploding all around me that I never once had a moment to think of a question of my own for Officer Brown. When I had interviewed people for my earlier stories in class, I had always taken a tape recorder with me to supplement my handwritten notes. But we weren't allowed to have tape recorders in the classroom. Why, I wondered, had they not recommended as a prerequisite for this class a course in shorthand? "Time up," said our professor at the end of 30 minutes. He thanked Officer Brown, who nodded briefly at us before making his exit. "Okay, class," up went the hand. "You may begin," down came the hand. Now it was like horses out of the gates of a racetrack. In an instant, the room was filled with a thunderous roar of clacking typewriters, clackety, 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 everyone but me banging furiously on the keys of a typewriter. I was still trying to decipher my notes. When did I start writing in hieroglyphics? My heart pounded. My brain flashed with fear. "Calm, be calm," I told myself, and I tried the best I could to block out the roar of the typewriters and to focus on my breathing. At last, I was able to make sense of some of my scribbles, and as quickly as possible, I printed on a separate sheet of paper my translation of the half-words and squiggles that had served initially as my record of Officer Brown's comments. When my transcription was complete, I looked up at the clock. Only 1 hour remained. I read through my list of facts. Oh my God, what kind of crap questions had my classmates been asking? How was I ever going to write a story about this man? There wasn't a single fact about him that was interesting. My scalp prickled. "Clackety, clackety, clackety, clackety," thundered my classmates on their typewriters. "Come on, come on, come on," I told myself. "You have to think of something." Nothing, nothing, nothing. I stared at the putrid yellow page. No words came. Never had a color looked so ugly. Clackety, 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 bring went my classmates as they slapped the return bar of their typewriters at the end of each line. Sweat puddled in my armpits, and in my stomach A small volcano of gaseous fluids erupted. I glanced at the clock. 45 minutes. Come on, come on, come on, you fool. Don't sit here like a dolt. You have to write something. Clackety, 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 bring! Never had I heard such furious typing. Never had I been so jealous. I continued to stare. Not a single thought came to me. Clackety, 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 rip, splat, came the noise from all over the room as my classmates tore completed pages from their typewriters and slapped the pages hard upon their desks. Were they showing off? My God, how were they able to write so quickly? How had their thoughts formed so effortlessly in their heads? Clackety, 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 rip, splat. Now it was all coming back to me. Why, I hated writing. The blank page, the ticking clock. Only this time, I didn't have an entire night of staring at the page of my typewriter. Only 30 minutes to go. Clackety, 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 bring! I glanced around the room, the words of my classmates erupting from them like black specks of vomit on their yellow pages. Obviously, they were androids, their hands all a blur upon their typewriter keys. Clackety, 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 bring, rip, splat! I looked at my professor, who was casually leaning back in his chair, his feet propped on his desk, his head hidden behind the wide-open newspaper in his arms. He was oblivious to my pain. In a room filled with the cacophonous racket of 19 pairs of hands furiously pounding the keys of 19 typewriters, it probably never occurred to him that one of his students wasn't typing. Clackety, 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 bring! 20 minutes to go. Finally, my mind expelled what felt like a priceless gem. A sentence. At last, words upon the page. Eagerly I waited, completely confident that now my brain was going to produce. I sat and I waited for more words to appear. Nothing. Nothing. The problem was, I now realized, I didn't know how to connect my one single sentence at the top of the page to all of the other facts concerning Officer Brown's life. Clackety, 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 bring, rip, splat. 15 minutes left to go. Come on, come on, come on, I inwardly screamed at my brain. You can't just sit here. God damn it, you fool, type! Clackety, 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 bring! I sat and stared at my one single sentence. If I couldn't figure out how to connect it to my other facts, I knew that I needed to rip it out of my typewriter and start all over again. Come on, come on, come on! Clackety, 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 bring, rip, splat! I couldn't do it. There was something about this sentence that had captivated my mind. My brain had taken the only tiny fact about Officer Brown that was of the least bit of interest to me, his love of fishing, and it had turned that one single fact into what sounded like the line from a poem, or, I imagined, the beginning sentence of a novel. Oh my God, what was wrong with me? What in the hell was happening? Clackety, 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 ring! Went the bell that signaled the end of the exam period. And then, from around the room it came, rip, splat, rip, splat, rip, splat, the sounds of all my fellow students, rip, splat, as every single one of them, rip, splat, tore out the final page, rip, splat, of their very last story in our class. As my classmates filed to the front of the room with their finished yellow-paged masterpieces, I did not move. I continued to stare at my one single sentence. Even now, some part of me wasn't ready to give up. There had to be a way to connect this sentence with the rest of my collected facts about Officer Brown. I was sure that if I could figure it out, maybe my professor would give me an extra half hour to finish. The room was quiet. I looked up. My professor, sauntering towards me, bore the slight smile of a man who is expecting a pleasant surprise. He probably thought I was mulling over my final sentence, trying my best to craft a closing phrase with just the right amount of zing. "Oh my God," he said when he arrived to stand behind me. Turning around to look up at him, I saw the look of pity in his eyes. "My brain froze," I said, quickly turning back to my single sentence on the yellow page. I did not want him to see the tears that were beginning to form in my eyes. I tried and I tried, but I just couldn't think of a way to connect this sentence with the rest of my facts. I thought it was a great beginning, very creative. I wanted to make it work. "It is very creative," he said, "but not at all appropriate for today's assignment. You would have needed a more in-depth interview to write the kind of essay you've begun. When you realized you couldn't go beyond this sentence, you should have torn this page out of your typewriter and started afresh." "I know," I said, and then after a pause, "Will I be flunking your class?" He ran a hand through his gray head of hair and sighed. "You were one of my best students," he said. "How can I flunk you? But this is definitely going to bring your grade down." Gently, he lifted my one-sentence story of Officer Brown out of my typewriter. He placed it on top of my pile of scattered notes. Then he returned to his desk to stuff it, along with all the papers of my classmates, into an old, battered briefcase. Standing to the side of his desk, briefcase in hand, he said, "If it makes you feel any better, you're not the first." "Really?" I asked. 2 years ago, another student froze, just like you, during the final." "Girl or guy?" I asked. "A young man," he said. "And he was talented, just like you. I think the problem is you both take your writing too damn seriously. Remember, journalism is not about creating beauty. It's about collecting the facts, then arranging them in their proper order. That's it." "Did that other student drop out of journalism?" I asked. "Hell no," he said, pointing a finger at me, "and neither should you." My final grade for the class was a C. I sometimes wish he had failed me, because then I would have dropped out of journalism, and the next year of my life would have been easier. I probably would not have gotten fat. "Hi, my name is Chub, and I have a problem with overeating." "Hello, Chub." Actually, that's not how it happened. Chub is the name my brother Slade gave me after I came home during the fall break of my junior year looking fat. What actually happened at the first Overeaters Anonymous meeting I ever attended was this. "Hi, my name is Shelley, and I have a problem with overeating." "Hello, Shelley," came the Greek chorus of voices from the overweight individuals who sat in large lumps upon a circle of metal folding chairs in the middle of a church basement. It was the same church where the out-of-the-closet pianist and I had practiced almost 2 years before. I could tell by the faces of the OA members they didn't think I was very fat. "What's she doing here?" their eyes broadcast to each other. Everyone else looked to be at least 200 pounds overweight, And here I was carrying a mere 30 pounds of excess weight. For my next meeting, I traveled to nearby Durham, thinking that folks in that city might be a bit slimmer. But the OA members of Durham were just as heavy as their Chapel Hill compatriots. So I stopped attending OA meetings, even though, like any other OA member, I could not stop overeating. I blamed my overeating on the journalism disaster that had occurred the semester before when my brain froze up on me during my final exam and I was unable to write. The experience seemed to have jinxed me. Now that I was an official student at the UNC-J school, I had a minimum of 3 papers to write each week. Whereas some writers drank or chain smoked their way through the many hours of sitting before their typewriters, I chain chewed my way through the hours I spent in front of my typewriter. Each week, like a squirrel, I gnawed my way through the wall of the blank page that greeted me every time I slapped a new piece of paper into my typewriter. At first, as I had done back in high school, I tried chewing gum. I would go through 20 packs in one evening. But chewing so much gum throughout the week had caused a painful stomach ulcer to form inside of me. No more gum, the doctor had said. Next, I tried chomping on ice, but that had cracked one of my teeth. No more ice, the dentist had said. Then I tried the sweet crunch of cookies, and they worked like a charm. As long as I kept myself chewing, I could keep my fear of the blank page at bay. Then I knew it would be possible for me to finish whatever paper was due the next day. On the occasional night when I tried to refrain from chewing sweet, crunchy cookies for fear that I was becoming too fat, the blank page had remained blank. I had to chew. It was the only way I could produce words upon the page. Oreo cookies soon became my brand of choice. Usually 1 bag would do me for the evening, and my paper would be finished by midnight. But sometimes the paper wasn't finished until 2 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and then I needed 2 bags of cookies. My body expanded quickly on its fertilizer of sugar, and the more sugar I ate, the more sugar I craved. Soon I was eating sugary snacks throughout the day. Even my main course meals contained sugar. Donuts for breakfast, chocolate-covered peanuts for lunch, sugar-coated breakfast cereal for supper. I knew that if I didn't figure out how to stop overeating, soon I would be able to attend OA meetings free of guilt because I would be just as heavy as everyone else. One day, I watched in fascination as a fellow co-ed lit up a cigarette in a library lounge. Smoking was allowed then in libraries in designated areas. She was the most relaxed and beautifully poised smoker I had ever seen. Her legs and bare feet gracefully crossed atop the large upholstered chair where she sat, her back perfectly straight, her bare arms slender, her leotard-covered waist enviably trim. She looked like a swan each time she tilted her head back to release from the small opening of her mouth yet another swirling, hypnotic cloud of smoke, smoke that danced up to the ceiling in front of the floor-length window that framed her chair. That very afternoon, on my way home from campus, I purchased a pink cigarette lighter and a package of Virginia Slims. Like the girl from the library, I would be slim. Like the girl from the library, I would be graceful. And like the girl from the library, I would be calm, even as I sat before my typewriter. No more cookies, no more fat. Cigarettes would be my saving grace. Since Sal was away for the weekend, I lit my first cigarette comfortably settled upon the sofa of our living room, where, like the girl from the library, I crossed my legs and kept my back as straight as possible. But after my first inhalation, my throat erupted into a coughing spasm that lasted a good 10 minutes. This was going to be harder than expected, but I was determined. Eyes watering, lifting my cigarette to my mouth for a second inhalation, I was suddenly stopped by a message from the soundless inner voice. "Go look at yourself in the mirror," it said. Oh, what fun, I thought. Happily, I hopped up and made my way to the bathroom so I could stand before the large mirror above the sink. Would I look as graceful as the girl from the library? Or would I look like one of the female reporters I had seen in a black and white picture of a journalism book? Professional, in control. "Oh my God!" I exclaimed. "I look like a female truck driver." This one small cigarette, perched in between my lips, had transformed my face into a tough and unforgiving expression that said, "Get out of my way, I'm coming through and my rig's bigger than yours." Flinging my cigarette into the toilet bowl, I raced back to the living room to retrieve my pink cigarette lighter and my package of Virginia Slims. Angrily, I flung them both into the kitchen trash can. How was I ever going to become slim again? Then I remembered how, in a history class, I had read that wealthy Roman citizens would sometimes make themselves vomit in order to continue gorging themselves during a feast. If I did the same thing each time I finished off a bag of Oreo cookies, surely I would begin to shed my excess weight. What a brilliant idea! The only problem was, no matter how far down my throat I tried to shove my fingers, all I produced was a small bit of gagging. How, I wondered, had the Romans managed such an efficient form of purging? Then I decided that if I couldn't make it come out one end, I would try the other. I practically skipped to the local A&P and was happy to discover that X-Lax came in sweetly flavored squares of chocolate. How convenient! And yum! How tasty! From that day forward, I began to routinely give myself the runs. I loaded up on the X-Lax in the evenings before bed, and by the next morning, I was shooting water out of my butt into the toilet. Within a week, my body was beginning to look a little slimmer, and it wasn't just my imagination. Others began to notice too. One day, John said, "Gee, Shelley, looks like you've lost some weight." Another afternoon, a fellow classmate asked, "Shelley, what diet are you on?" I just started to cut back. I didn't want anyone to know about my secret chocolate-flavored X-Lax path to skinniness. But within weeks, my bouts of diarrhea increased, so that I soon needed easy access to a toilet throughout the entire day. Sal, and even some of my classmates, began to ask, "What's wrong with you? Are you sick?" "Oh, I think it's just something I ate," I would say. And then one day, as I was flipping through a women's magazine at a relative's house over Thanksgiving break, 3 words snagged my eye: college co-eds, overeating. I flipped back a page and began to read. I could feel my face reddening. All over the country, women my age were uncontrollably binging on junk food and then purging later, either by inducing vomiting with a finger or a spoon, or by inducing diarrhea through the overuse of laxatives. Shame filled my entire being. There was something wrong with me. Truly wrong with me. Psychiatrists had even given it a name: bulimia. I had always feared that I might be crazy, but now I had confirmation. I was a bulimic. How horrible the words sounded in my mind. My heart thumped. I hadn't known that craziness came in so many different varieties, but now I knew. Not only was I crazy like all those thousands of other young women in the country, I was also doing my body a great deal of harm. According to the article, we bulimics were damaging our hearts due to an imbalance of electrolytes and lower levels of potassium that resulted from our frequent purging. For those of us who were vomiting, there was the ongoing damage to tooth enamel, not to mention damage to the lining of throats and mouths from the presence of all that stomach acid in an area where it didn't belong. And for those of us who were abusing laxatives, there was an increased risk of gastrointestinal bleeding and damage to the rectum, not to mention the risk of becoming dependent upon the laxatives. Holy crap! When I got back to my apartment, the end of break, I threw out my remaining boxes of chocolate-flavored X-Lax, and I decided that in order to learn more about my problem, I would write an article about the wave of excessive overeating and purging that had swept across the college campuses of our country. The article would serve as a final paper in my investigative reporting class for that term. Never once did I consider seeking help from a professional, even though the magazine article had recommended counseling for all bulimics. My fear of being labeled insane by a professional was still too overwhelming. I placed an ad in the campus paper searching for students to interview who, like me, were binging and purging. Only 2 students responded to my ad, but one of them was a male graduate student from Iran who, faced with such a plethora of food choices in American grocery stores, had not been able to control himself. Blessed with a fast metabolism that had fortunately kept him skinny, he was eating, just as I, a continuous diet of sugary foods throughout the day. The other student I interviewed, a female who had been diagnosed with bulimia, recommended me to the psychiatrist she had used for her treatment. After reading a number of articles about eating disorders in the journals of UNC's medical school, I then interviewed a psychologist from Durham who dealt with eating disorders. We had been introduced at the Overeaters Anonymous meeting in Durham. I also interviewed the psychiatrist from nearby Raleigh whom the female student had recommended. At the end of my interview with the psychiatrist, I confessed to him that I too had a problem with binging and had only recently quit abusing laxatives. "This is the real reason I decided to write this article," I said. "I suspected as much," he responded. That was when he told me that his first recommendation to each one of his bulimic patients was to keep a daily food journal. "Record every bite of food you eat," he said. "List all the reasons you can think of for having eaten that particular food. Afterwards, write about how you felt as you were eating. In what way did this food serve you?" When my interview was over, I drove to a nearby office supplies store and purchased my first ever journal, an inexpensive black and white composition notebook, which I entitled Notes from Chub. My daily journal writing in my black and white Notes from Chub composition book helped me to gain a small measure of control over my eating habits. This was mainly due to the fact that since it took so much time to write about my eating, I would on occasion refrain from eating a sugary snack simply because I felt too lazy to write about it afterwards in my journal. But my nighttime orgy of Oreo cookie binging continued each and every time I had yet another journalism paper due. I knew that I needed additional help, but I was still too afraid to visit any sort of counselor as a patient. One day, feeling desperate, I decided to ask my invisible friend for help. What can I do to gain control over my binging? I silently transmitted to the larger mind. The answer I received was not at all what I had expected. Stand naked in front of the mirror every day and say to your body, "Body, you are beautiful. I love you." What in the hell kind of advice was that? I'm not going to look at my disgusting body in the mirror, I angrily transmitted. I asked you for help, not a form of punishment. For God's sake, I already feel guilty enough. I did my best to ignore the message from within, but several days later, after getting out of the shower, I snuck a brief peek at my naked body in the mirror. Oh my God! I turned away. It was just as horrible as I had imagined. Such a huge expanse of bulging, pale flesh. How could anyone ever love such a body? 2 more weeks passed. One morning, I happened to glance in the mirror again, this time for a little bit longer. I tried to imagine that I was a scientist in a lab studying my body as a specimen. Ugh! My game of imagination didn't work. I still felt utterly disgusted and repulsed by the image of my body in the mirror. Closing my eyes, I turned away. But for some reason, perhaps purely for the hell of it, I murmured in a quick, mechanical monotone, "Body, you are beautiful, I love you." My eyes were still closed. I didn't mean a single word of it. How could I when my body was so hideous? Yet for some reason I dutifully continued to repeat this affirmation to my naked body once a day before my morning shower. The glimpses of my body continued to be nothing more than a quick glance in the mirror, my daily delivered affirmation nothing more than a murmured monotone. But one morning, repeating yet again my mechanical affirmation, "Body, you are beautiful," a sudden shift occurred. It was as if a switch in my brain had been clicked to the on position. I saw, truly for the first time, that my body was indeed beautiful. The creaminess of its soft, ivory-colored flesh, the smooth, rounded curve of its belly, 2 arms that now looked strong rather than flabby, full breasts that radiated their potential to nourish, curly, untamed mahogany hair, and 2 smiling, blue-green eyes softened by the presence of forming tears. It was a work of art, this body of mine. My God, why had I never seen this? "Body," I said very quietly to my reflection in the mirror, "I am so sorry. Please forgive me. You are beautiful. I love you." This time, I really meant it. After that moment in the bathroom, I found that it was no longer satisfying to gorge my stomach with crunchy, sugary foods. Oreo cookies were not a way to love my body. Having said the words, "I love you" to my body in a way that I truly meant, made me begin to follow through with acts of love for my body. Almost overnight, I began to eat healthier foods, sandwiches for lunch, salads for supper, a boiled egg and a piece of toast for breakfast every morning. And I began to walk the 2 miles from my apartment into campus every day instead of driving or taking the bus. Within 2 months, my body lost 20 pounds. Even my desire to chew as I sat before my typewriter in the evenings was quickly replaced by a desire to sip on unsweetened tea. One day I found myself remembering the words of my first journalism professor. Journalism is about collecting the facts, then arranging them in their proper order. Why had I not been able to see this? How had such a simple form of writing ever scared me? No wonder my classmates had been able to type so quickly their stories about Officer Brown. There was nothing to it. Writing journalism stories was a cinch. Could it be that at long last I had tackled my fear of the blank page? I sure did hope so. Towards the end of the spring semester of my junior year, feeling slim and in control of my body and my writing, I was asked to fill in one morning for Martin Serjan, the weekday morning newsman at WUNC. Akin to a partner in a dance, it was Martin's job, and for this morning, now also mine, to weave in and out of the various segments of NPR's morning edition's national and world news, supplying the local and state news along with the daily weather. It was far more challenging than I had expected. While I delivered the regional news on air, not only did I have to hold a headphone speaker to one ear so that I could continue listening to the ongoing stories of Morning Edition, I also had to keep my eye on the clock. That way I would know when, to the very second, it was time to dive back in and rejoin NPR's nationally broadcast morning news program. My mind was kept so busy watching the clock and listening to the continuing broadcast of Morning Edition as I delivered regional news and weather, I found it impossible to pay attention to the sound of my own voice. That is why it came as a complete surprise when one of my journalism professors told me later that day at school, "Shelley, I heard you this morning. You've definitely got the chops for broadcast news. You're a natural." "Thank you," I said. But I really had no idea how I had sounded, because while I had been delivering the news, I had also been listening to the voices of NPR's Morning Edition in one ear. Gary Shivers, WUNC's manager, had also been listening that morning. "You let me know when you're ready," he told me a few days afterwards, "and I'll open the doors for you at NPR." "Wow, that sounds great," I said. But on the inside, I was still a little disturbed by the fact that I had not, at a conscious level, exerted any sort of control over how my voice had sounded the day I had filled in for WUNC's morning man, Martin Serjan. I worried that, at an unconscious level, I had done nothing more than mimic the Morning Edition voices in the same way I had once mimicked the pitches of the alto who had sung beside me during my brief stint with the Carolina Choir. To me, mimicking the voice of another felt a bit like cheating. But on the other hand, maybe this was how all broadcasting voices were created in the beginning stage of one's career. Was I being too hard on myself? I didn't know. My past mistakes, since I had come to college, had shown me one thing. I didn't know what in the hell I was doing. Internally, I felt like a blind person groping in the dark for something, anything at all, that felt concrete enough to support me. Not too long after that, Tim Warner, who was second in command at WUNC, called me into his office one day. "Great news," he said, his face alight with a happy smile. "We've decided we want to move you to the weekday early morning news shift." "Oh my God," I said. "But what about Martin?" "He's gotten tired of the early morning hours. He said it was time to move on." "Whoa," I said. "I can't believe it. This is so cool that you guys want me on the weekday shift. We know you're young, Tim continued, but we have complete confidence in you. Your voice blends well with the morning edition voices, and, well, you're a journalism major, so the weekday shift will be a better fit for you, for your career. Yes, I said. I suppose it will be better, thank you. So, is that a yes? I opened my mouth, a big smile on my face. Of course I was going to say yes. If I worked the weekday morning shift, then in about a year or so, I could ask Gary to open those doors for me at NPR, and I'd be moving on up, just like the African American couple, the Jeffersons, from the highly ranked television show of that time. This was going to be so great. My journalism professors would be proud. My parents would be proud. I would be proud. Tim, still smiling, waited for the yes to pop out of my mouth. Where in the hell was my yes? Why couldn't I spit it out? What in the world was holding me back? And then I knew. Deep, deep inside was a quiet, barely perceptible wail of sadness. It felt as if my heart were speaking to me, not with words, but through a soft pinprick of distress. Once I became aware of it, I found that I couldn't ignore it in the same way a mother cannot ignore the cries of her baby. I'm so sorry, Tim, I said. I am so, so sorry. I thought for sure that my answer would be yes, but now I know that I must say no. Tim was no longer smiling. I hope you understand that it's quite an honor that you were offered this job. Believe me, I said, I know that. And out of a sense of loyalty to all of you, I wish I could say yes. Tim sighed. Then say yes, he said. Don't you realize that the ratings in this time slot are some of our highest? Why would you throw away this kind of opportunity? Quickly, I searched my heart, trying to put into words what I was feeling deep inside. I guess I'm remembering how much I've been helped by my weekend shifts, I said. There have been so many weeks when I was really struggling this past year. Looking back, I'd say that it was my weekend job here that kept me going. Tim, when I sit in that announcer's chair playing all that beautiful music, it's like I've taken a happiness drug. It's the music, I now realize, rather than the news, that makes my heart sing. So if it's all right with you and Gary, I'd like to keep my weekend shift because then I'll continue to be with the music. It's what I need, most especially now, to get through my last year of college. Tim shook his head. But you could just listen to all this same music on your stereo. My record collection is not as extensive, I said. Here at the station, I continue to be exposed to music I didn't even know existed. That's one of the other reasons I love my job so much. It's been a really cool learning experience for me, something that I truly, truly look forward to at the end of each week. Well, said Tim, and he sighed again, I have to admit I'm disappointed. All of us will be disappointed, but I respect your decision. I had no idea you loved your weekend job so much. Yes, I said, I do. And then I made a confession to Tim. You know, as strange as it sounds, I don't think I've ever really enjoyed listening to or reading the news. I think I mainly majored in journalism to get over my fear of writing. At this point, my dream job would be to work here full time during the week as a classical music announcer. Gone, I now realized, was my dream of writing stories from the heart. I figured I would probably have to work as a reporter for a good 20 years before I would ever be allowed to write such stories. And I didn't like the news enough to wait that long. Okay, said Tim. I'll pass on to Gary everything you've said. Kevin Wolfe was happy to take over the weekday morning news shift, and I remained in my beloved time slot Saturday and Sunday mornings. Kevin was happy, I was happy, but most important of all, my heart was happy. As I had the year before, I planned to stay in Chapel Hill for the summer. Not only would I continue working part-time on the weekends at WUNC, I would also, as I had the summer before, be working during the week at Wilson Library, the graduate library, where I had once sought refuge from those students who, during my freshman year of college, had begun knocking on my door in the evenings. I enjoyed my life in Chapel Hill, most especially during the summertime when I didn't have to be attending class. Though I was proud of how I had conquered my fear of writing, now that that fear was behind me, I figured I would remain a weekend music announcer at my beloved public radio station, and after graduation, I would supplement my part-time radio work with a weekday job. It didn't matter what kind of job. Perhaps the folks in the periodicals department of Wilson Library would allow me to continue working for them. I had found my piece of heaven in a small, dimly lit basement studio of a public radio station. There was no way I would ever leave. No matter how long I had to wait, I would eventually become a full-time music announcer at WUNC.